Welcome to a peaceful journey through history's most fascinating myths. Tonight, we will explore 30 famous historical events that everyone believes happened, but actually never occurred at all. From Napoleon's supposed short stature to Vikings wearing horned helmets, from Marie Antoinette's cake comment to Columbus proving the Earth was round, these beloved stories have shaped our understanding of the past. Yet none of them are actually true. As you settle in comfortably, let these gentle revelations about historical misconceptions guide your thoughts toward rest. Each surprising discovery will help your mind unwind as we explore the fascinating difference between what we believe happened and what actually occurred. So relax, breathe deeply, and drift peacefully through these 30 myths that have captured human imagination for generations. Sweet dreams await. 1. Einstein failed math. One of the most persistent myths about Albert Einstein is that he failed mathematics during his school years. This comforting story suggests that even the greatest scientific mind of the 20th century struggled with basic math, giving hope to students everywhere. However, this tale is completely false and has no basis in historical fact. Einstein actually excelled at mathematics from a very young age. By the time he was 12 years old, he had already taught himself algebra and geometry. He mastered differential and integral calculus before his 15th birthday, which was remarkably advanced for someone his age. His academic records from the Swiss Federal Polytechnic show that he received excellent grades in mathematical subjects. The confusion likely arose from a misunderstanding about the Swiss grading system. In Switzerland, 6 is the highest possible grade, while 1 is the lowest. This is the opposite of many other educational systems where 1 might be considered excellent. When people saw Einstein had received a 6 in mathematics, they incorrectly assumed this meant he had failed, when in reality it meant he had achieved the highest possible score. Einstein himself once responded to this myth by saying that before he was 15, he had mastered differential and integral calculus. He found the rumor amusing but also somewhat frustrating, as it misrepresented his genuine passion and talent for mathematical thinking. This myth persists because it makes Einstein seem more relatable and human. People find comfort in believing that genius can emerge from academic struggle, but Einstein's true story shows that exceptional mathematical ability was evident from his earliest years. 2 Viking horned helmets. The image of fierce Viking warriors charging into battle wearing horned helmets has become one of the most recognizable symbols in popular culture. From operas to movies, from comic books to Halloween costumes, the horned helmet has become synonymous with Norse culture. However, archaeological evidence clearly shows that Vikings never actually wore horned helmets in battle. No authentic Viking helmet with horns has ever been discovered by archaeologists. The few Viking helmets that have survived from this period are simple, practical designs made of iron or leather. These helmets were rounded or conical in shape, designed to deflect blows and protect the wearer's head during combat. Adding horns would have been not only unnecessary, but also dangerous, as they would have provided opponents with something to grab during close combat. The horned helmet myth originated in the 19th century during the Romantic period, when artists and writers became fascinated with Norse mythology. The most significant contributor to this misconception was the costume designer Carl Emil Doppler, who created horned helmets for Richard Wagner's opera cycle, The Ring of the Nibelung, in the 1870s. These dramatic costumes captured the public imagination and became the standard visual representation of Vikings. Some horned helmets do exist from the Bronze Age, about 1,000 years before the Viking era. These ceremonial items were likely used for religious rituals rather than warfare. The confusion between these ancient ceremonial objects and Viking battle gear helped perpetuate the myth. The reality is that Vikings were practical warriors who valued effective protection over dramatic appearance. Their actual helmets were efficient, lightweight, and designed purely for survival in combat rather than theatrical impact. 3. Let them eat cake. The phrase "let them eat cake" has become forever associated with Marie Antoinette, the Austrian-born Queen of France during the turbulent years leading up to the French Revolution. According to popular legend, when told that the French peasants had no bread to eat, the Queen callously responded with this infamous phrase, demonstrating her complete disconnect from the suffering of her subjects. However, historical evidence strongly suggests that Marie Antoinette never spoke these words. The phrase actually appears in Jean-Jacques Rousseau's autobiographical work, Confessions, which was written around 1765, when Marie Antoinette was only 10 years old and still living in Austria. Rousseau attributed the quote to a great princess, but he was clearly not referring to the future French queen. The original French phrase was "qu'ils mangent de la brioche," which translates to "let them eat brioche," a type of sweet bread rather than cake. This quote became attached to Marie Antoinette during the French Revolution as part of revolutionary propaganda designed to portray the royal family as heartless and out of touch with the common people. Revolutionary pamphlets and newspapers spread numerous false stories about the Queen to justify the growing anger against the monarchy. Historical records actually show that Marie Antoinette was involved in charitable activities and showed concern for the welfare of French citizens. She established a model village at Versailles where she could experience a simpler way of life, and she supported various charitable causes throughout her reign. The persistence of this myth demonstrates how powerful propaganda can become accepted as historical fact. The quote perfectly encapsulated everything that revolutionaries wanted people to believe about aristocratic indifference, making it an effective tool for political mobilization that outlasted the revolution itself. 4. War of the Worlds. Panic. On October 30th, 1938, Orson Welles broadcast his famous radio adaptation of H.G. Wells' The War of the Worlds on CBS Radio. According to widespread reports, this realistic-sounding broadcast about a Martian invasion caused mass panic across America, with millions of listeners believing that aliens were actually attacking Earth. People allegedly fled their homes, flooded police stations with calls, and prepared for the end of the world. However, this story of widespread panic is largely exaggerated and has become one of the most persistent myths in broadcasting history. Contemporary evidence suggests that very few people actually believed the broadcast was real. The program aired opposite the extremely popular Chase and Sanborn Hour on NBC, which meant that most radio listeners were tuned to the competing show. Additionally, the CBS broadcast included multiple announcements that it was a fictional drama, and listeners who tuned in from the beginning would have heard the opening credits clearly identifying it as an adaptation of the Wells novel. The myth of mass panic was largely created by newspapers the following day. Many newspapers were already concerned about radio's growing influence on their readership and advertising revenue. The supposed panic provided them with an opportunity to criticize radio as an unreliable and dangerous medium. Headlines screamed about the chaos caused by the broadcast, but these reports were based on very limited evidence. Modern research has shown that while some people did call radio stations and police departments to inquire about the broadcast, the number was relatively small and hardly constituted mass hysteria. Most of these calls came from people who had missed the opening of the program and were simply seeking clarification. This myth persists because it serves as a cautionary tale about media influence and public gullibility, themes that remain relevant in our modern age of information. 5. Columbus proved Earth round. One of the most enduring myths about Christopher Columbus is that he set sail in 1492 to prove that the Earth was round, bravely challenging the widespread medieval belief that the world was flat. According to this popular story, Columbus faced ridicule and opposition from scholars and clergy who insisted that he would sail off the edge of the world. However, this narrative is historically inaccurate and misrepresents both Columbus's motivations and medieval knowledge. Educated people in Columbus's time already knew that the Earth was round. This knowledge dated back to ancient Greek scholars like Eratosthenes, who had calculated the Earth's circumference around 250 BCE. Medieval scholars, including prominent church figures, accepted and taught that the Earth was spherical. Universities across Europe taught geography based on this understanding, and numerous medieval texts described the Earth's round shape. Columbus's actual goal was not to prove the Earth's roundness, but to find a western sea route to Asia for trade purposes. The real debate centered on the size of the Earth and the distance to Asia. Columbus believed the Earth was smaller than it actually is, and that Asia extended much further east than it does. Most scholars correctly argued that the distance would be too great for ships to carry enough supplies, which is exactly what would have happened if the Americas had not been there to provide an unexpected stopping point. The flat Earth myth about Columbus appears to have originated in the 19th century, particularly through Washington Irving's biography of Columbus, published in 1828. Irving dramatized the story for literary effect, creating the fictional conflict between Columbus and flat Earth believers. This myth persists because it fits a compelling narrative about scientific progress triumphing over ignorance, even though the historical reality was quite different. 6. Medieval people never bathed. A widespread misconception about medieval life suggests that people during the Middle Ages never bathed and lived in constant filth. This myth paints a picture of dirty, smelly populations who feared water and considered cleanliness sinful. Popular culture has reinforced this image through movies and books depicting medieval characters as perpetually grimy. However, historical evidence reveals that medieval people actually valued cleanliness and bathed regularly according to the standards and resources of their time. Medieval Europeans understood the importance of personal hygiene and cleanliness. Public bathhouses were common in many medieval cities, particularly during the 12th and 13th centuries. These establishments served not only hygienic purposes but also functioned as social gathering places. People would visit bathhouses weekly or even more frequently, depending on their financial means and local availability. Private bathing also occurred regularly in medieval households. Wealthy families owned wooden bathtubs and had servants prepare hot baths. Even modest households would heat water for washing, though they might not have dedicated bathing vessels. Medieval people commonly washed their hands and faces daily, and full body washing occurred at least weekly for most social classes. The confusion about medieval hygiene partly stems from changes that occurred during the late medieval period and early Renaissance. The Black Death and other diseases led to suspicion about public bathhouses as people began to associate them with disease transmission. Additionally, some religious movements promoted spiritual purity over physical cleanliness, though this was not universal church doctrine. Medieval medical texts also emphasized the importance of cleanliness for health. Physicians recommended regular bathing and provided detailed instructions for maintaining personal hygiene. The reality of medieval life included much more attention to cleanliness than popular stereotypes suggest. 7. Disney frozen after death. One of the most persistent urban legends claims that Walt Disney had his body cryogenically frozen after his death, hoping that future technology would eventually allow him to be revived. This myth has become so widespread that many people accept it as fact, imagining Disney's preserved body waiting somewhere in a frozen chamber. However, this story is completely false and has no basis in reality. Walt Disney died on December 15, 1966, from complications related to lung cancer. He was cremated 2 days after his death, and his ashes were interred at Forest Lawn Memorial Park in Glendale, California. The cremation was a simple, private ceremony attended only by close family members, following Disney's own wishes for a modest funeral service. The cryogenic freezing myth appears to have originated from confusion about the timing of Disney's death and the establishment of the first cryonics company. The Cryonics Society of California was founded in 1965, just 1 year before Disney's death, which led to speculation about whether he might have been interested in the procedure. However, there is no evidence that Disney ever expressed interest in cryonic preservation or even knew about the technology. The first person to actually undergo cryonic preservation was Dr. James Bedford, who was frozen in January 1967, about 1 month after Disney's death. This timing may have contributed to the confusion and helped spawn the urban legend. Disney's family has repeatedly denied the freezing claims, and official records clearly document his cremation. The myth persists partly because it seems to fit Disney's reputation as a technological innovator who was always interested in future possibilities. The story also appeals to people who find comfort in imagining that the beloved creator might somehow return. 8. Napoleon was short. Napoleon Bonaparte is often remembered as a short, diminutive figure whose small stature supposedly fueled his ambitious drive to conquer Europe. This image of the little corporal has become so ingrained in popular culture that his alleged shortness is considered common knowledge. Political cartoons and popular media have perpetuated this characterization for more than 2 centuries. However, historical evidence clearly shows that Napoleon was actually average height for men of his era. At the time of his autopsy, Napoleon measured 5 feet 2 inches, but this measurement was taken using French units. When converted to English measurements, Napoleon stood approximately 5 feet 7 inches tall. This height was completely normal, even slightly above average, for European men in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. Improved nutrition and living conditions have made modern populations taller, creating the false impression that people from earlier eras were uniformly short. The confusion about Napoleon's height originated from differences between French and English measurement systems. British propaganda during the Napoleonic Wars exploited this confusion, depicting Napoleon as physically small to diminish his threatening presence. Political cartoonists like James Gillray created caricatures showing Napoleon as a tiny figure, which proved effective for British morale and propaganda purposes. Additionally, Napoleon's nickname, Le Petit Caporal, the Little Corporal, referred to his military rank early in his career, not his physical stature. The term petit in this context meant junior or lesser in rank, not small in size. Contemporary accounts from people who met Napoleon describe him as average in height and possessing a commanding presence. His actual physical appearance was unremarkable for his time, which makes the persistence of the short Napoleon myth all the more interesting as an example of how political propaganda can become accepted historical fact. 9. Salem witches burned. The Salem witch trials of 1692 and 1693 represent one of the darkest chapters in American colonial history. Popular culture often depicts these tragic events with images of accused witches being burned at the stake, surrounded by angry crowds and roaring flames. This dramatic imagery has become the standard representation of how witch trials concluded. However, none of the people executed during the Salem witch trials were actually burned to death. Of the 20 people executed during the Salem trials, 19 were hanged and 1 was pressed to death with heavy stones. Hanging was the standard method of execution in colonial New England for serious crimes, including witchcraft. The executions took place on what became known as Gallows Hill, where simple wooden gallows were erected for the purpose. The one person who died by pressing, Giles Corey, refused to enter a plea and was slowly crushed under heavy stones, according to an archaic legal procedure designed to compel testimony. The confusion about burning likely comes from European witch trial practices. In some parts of Europe, particularly in Germanic regions, burning was indeed used as punishment for witchcraft. These European practices have become mixed together with American colonial history in popular imagination, creating the false impression that burning occurred in Salem as well. The Salem trials were characterized by spectral evidence, mass hysteria, and judicial procedures that would be considered deeply flawed by modern standards. The accused faced impossible situations where denial of guilt was considered evidence of defiance, while confession might spare their lives but destroy their reputations and property. The tragedy of Salem lies not in the method of execution, but in the breakdown of rational legal processes and the community dynamics that allowed fear and suspicion to overcome justice and common sense. 10. Great Wall visible. From space. For decades, people have claimed that the Great Wall of China is the only human-made structure visible from space with the naked eye. This assertion has appeared in textbooks, travel guides, and casual conversations around the world. The claim seems plausible given the wall's immense length of over 13,000 miles and its historical significance as one of humanity's greatest construction achievements. However, astronauts and space agencies have repeatedly confirmed that this popular belief is false. Multiple astronauts have testified that the Great Wall is not visible from space without mechanical aid. The wall, while extraordinarily long, is relatively narrow, averaging only about 21 feet in width. From the altitude of the International Space Station, which orbits approximately 250 miles above Earth, the wall is far too thin to be distinguished with the naked eye. The colors and materials of the wall also blend in with the surrounding landscape, making it even more difficult to spot. NASA has officially debunked this myth, explaining that many other human-made structures are actually more visible from space than the Great Wall. Large cities, highways, airports, and dams create more distinctive patterns that stand out against natural terrain. At night, city lights are easily visible from space, but the Great Wall remains invisible even then. The myth likely originated from the wall's impressive scale and the natural human tendency to want to connect earthly achievements with cosmic perspectives. The idea that this ancient wonder could be seen from space appeals to our sense of human accomplishment and the wall's symbolic significance. Chinese astronaut Yang Liwei, the first Chinese citizen in space, confirmed in 2003 that he could not see the Great Wall during his orbital flight, definitively settling the question from a Chinese perspective. 11. The British are coming. Paul Revere's midnight ride on April 18, 1775, has become one of the most celebrated events in American Revolutionary history. According to popular legend, Revere galloped through the Massachusetts countryside shouting, "The British are coming," to warn colonial patriots that British troops were marching toward Lexington and Concord. This dramatic image of a lone patriot alerting the countryside has been immortalized in Henry Wadsworth Longfellow's famous poem. However, historical evidence shows that Revere never shouted this famous phrase during his ride. The problem with the phrase, "the British are coming," lies in its impracticality for the time period. In 1775, most American colonists still considered themselves British subjects, even those who opposed British policies. Shouting about the British coming would have been confusing and meaningless to people who identified as British themselves. Instead, Revere and other messengers would have warned about regulars or redcoats approaching, referring specifically to British soldiers rather than British people in general. Moreover, Revere's mission required stealth and secrecy, not loud proclamations. The countryside was filled with British patrols searching for exactly the kind of messenger activity that Revere was conducting. Shouting warnings would have immediately revealed his location to enemy forces and defeated the purpose of his covert operation. Historical records indicate that Revere made his warnings through quiet, door-to-door visits to key patriot leaders and trusted contacts. He would whisper urgent messages or speak in hushed tones to avoid detection. The network of colonial communication relied on discreet, careful coordination rather than dramatic public announcements. Longfellow's 1861 poem, Paul Revere's Ride, created the mythical version of events that most Americans remember today. The poem was written during the Civil War as inspirational literature rather than historical documentation, prioritizing dramatic effect over factual accuracy. 12. High noon gunfights. The image of two gunfighters facing each other in the dusty main street of a frontier town, hands hovering over their holsters as a clock strikes high noon, has become the quintessential symbol of the American Old West. Countless movies, television shows, and novels have depicted these formal duels as a common occurrence in frontier communities. The scenario typically involves a challenge, a specific time, and a ritualistic showdown that ends with one participant dead in the street. However, historical evidence shows that these formal high noon gunfights were extremely rare and bear little resemblance to actual violence in the American frontier. Real gunfights in the Old West were typically sudden, chaotic affairs that bore no resemblance to the choreographed duels of popular fiction. When violence occurred, it usually happened quickly and without warning. Participants might be drunk, angry, or acting impulsively rather than following any code of honor or formal procedure. Most shootings occurred in saloons, gambling halls, or other indoor locations rather than in the middle of town streets. Professional gunfighters, when they existed, preferred to gain every possible advantage rather than engaging in fair fights. They might shoot from cover, attack from behind, or use superior numbers to ensure victory. The idea of a fair, face-to-face duel was antithetical to survival on the frontier, where staying alive mattered more than maintaining honor or following romantic codes of conduct. Many famous figures associated with Old West violence, such as Wild Bill Hickok and Wyatt Earp, were involved in shootings that occurred under very different circumstances than the movie versions suggest. These real encounters were typically brief, brutal, and lacking in ceremony. The high noon duel became popular through dime novels, Wild West shows, and eventually Hollywood movies, which needed dramatic, visually appealing scenarios that would work well as entertainment rather than historical accuracy. 13. Medieval flat Earth belief. One of the most persistent myths about medieval European society claims that people during the Middle Ages universally believed the Earth was flat, and that anyone suggesting otherwise faced persecution from the Church. This misconception suggests that medieval Europeans lived in ignorant fear of sailing off the edge of the world, and that scientific progress was impossible under religious oppression. However, historical evidence clearly demonstrates that educated people throughout the medieval period knew the Earth was round, and that this knowledge was supported rather than suppressed by medieval institutions. Ancient Greek scholars had established the Earth's spherical nature centuries before the medieval period. Eratosthenes calculated the planet's circumference around 250 BCE, and this knowledge was preserved and transmitted through Roman and early Christian scholars. Medieval universities taught geography based on the understanding that the Earth was a sphere, and countless medieval texts describe the round Earth as accepted fact. The Catholic Church, often blamed for promoting flat Earth beliefs, actually supported the spherical Earth theory. Prominent church scholars like Thomas Aquinas and Albertus Magnus wrote extensively about the Earth's round shape. Medieval cathedrals sometimes included artistic representations of the spherical Earth, and church-sponsored educational institutions taught geography based on classical sources that described the planet's true shape. The confusion about medieval flat Earth beliefs appears to have originated in the 19th century, particularly through works like Washington Irving's biography of Christopher Columbus. Writers during the Romantic period enjoyed contrasting their enlightened age with what they imagined was medieval ignorance, even when this contrast was historically inaccurate. Medieval maps, such as the famous Mappa Mundi, sometimes appear flat to modern viewers, but these were often symbolic or religious representations rather than literal geographic documents. Practical navigation tools and scholarly texts from the same period clearly reflect understanding of the Earth's spherical nature. 14. Van Gogh's whole ear. The story of Vincent van Gogh cutting off his ear has become one of art history's most famous episodes of artistic madness and self-destruction. Popular culture depicts Van Gogh as completely severing his entire ear during a psychological breakdown in December 1888, creating a shocking act of self-mutilation that symbolizes the tortured artist's stereotype. However, historical evidence and medical analysis suggest that Van Gogh cut off only his earlobe, not his entire ear, making this one of art history's most exaggerated stories. Contemporary accounts from the time of the incident, including police reports and hospital records from Arles, France, indicate that Van Gogh injured his earlobe rather than removing his complete ear. The attending physician, Dr. Felix Ray, described the wound as affecting the lower portion of the ear. Letters between Van Gogh and his brother Theo also suggest that the injury was less severe than popular accounts suggest. The confusion about the extent of Van Gogh's self-injury likely arose from dramatic retellings of the story and the artist's own paintings depicting his bandaged head. Van Gogh created several self-portraits showing himself with extensive bandaging, but artistic interpretation and the need to cover medical dressings may have exaggerated the apparent severity of the wound. Some art historians have even suggested that Van Gogh might have lost part of his ear during a confrontation with fellow artist Paul Gauguin, rather than through deliberate self-harm. However, this alternative theory remains controversial and lacks definitive evidence. The complete ear amputation story fits perfectly with romantic notions about tortured, artistic genius and has become inseparable from Van Gogh's legacy. The reality of a more limited injury seems almost anticlimactic compared to the dramatic version that has captured public imagination for more than a century. 15. Christians versus lions. The image of early Christians being thrown to hungry lions in Roman amphitheaters has become one of the most powerful symbols of religious persecution and martyrdom. Popular culture, religious art, and historical fiction have repeatedly depicted scenes of faithful Christians facing savage beasts, while crowds of Romans cheer for blood and spectacle. These dramatic confrontations supposedly occurred regularly during the first few centuries of Christianity, as Roman emperors systematically tried to eliminate the new religion through public executions. However, historical evidence suggests that Christians being fed to lions was far less common than popular imagination suggests. While Christians did face persecution in the Roman Empire at various times, the specific practice of throwing them to lions appears to have been relatively rare. Roman records of arena events focus primarily on gladiator contests, animal hunts, and public executions of common criminals, rather than religious persecution spectacles. When Christians were executed publicly, they were more commonly crucified, beheaded, or burned, rather than fed to wild animals. The lion imagery likely became associated with Christian persecution through biblical references, particularly the story of Daniel in the lion's den, and through later Christian artwork that used lions to symbolize the trials faced by early believers. Medieval and Renaissance artists found the lion imagery dramatically compelling and used it extensively in religious paintings and sculptures. Roman arena events did involve wild animals, but these were typically elaborate hunting exhibitions or contests between trained fighters and beasts. The logistics and expense of maintaining lions specifically for executing Christians would have been considerable, making such spectacles impractical for regular use. Some isolated instances of Christians facing wild animals in arenas probably did occur, but the scale and frequency suggested by popular culture greatly exaggerates historical reality. The myth persists because it creates a powerful narrative about faith triumphing over persecution. 16. Washington's wooden teeth. George Washington's dental problems have become legendary in American history, with the widespread belief that the first president wore wooden dentures throughout his adult life. This story has been repeated in countless history books, museum exhibits, and educational materials, creating the image of Washington struggling to speak and eat with crude wooden teeth carved from tree bark or lumber. However, while Washington did indeed suffer from severe dental problems and wore dentures, none of his dental appliances were actually made from wood. Washington began losing teeth in his 20s, and by the time he became president, he had only one natural tooth remaining. His dental problems caused him considerable pain and affected his appearance, which is why many portraits from his later years show him with a somewhat sunken mouth. The dental technology of the 18th century was primitive by modern standards, but dentists of the era used materials they considered more suitable than wood. Washington's dentures were crafted from a combination of materials, including human teeth, animal teeth, lead, gold, and ivory. Some of his dental appliances incorporated teeth purchased from other people, a common practice at the time when poor individuals would sell their healthy teeth to wealthy customers who needed replacements. Animal teeth, particularly from horses and cows, were also commonly used in 18th century dentistry. The wooden teeth myth likely arose because Washington's ivory dentures became stained and discolored over time, giving them a wood-like appearance. Additionally, the word wooden was sometimes used metaphorically to describe anything stiff or awkward, which might have described how the dentures affected Washington's speech and eating. Surviving examples of Washington's dentures, preserved at Mount Vernon, clearly show the metal, ivory, and tooth construction that characterizes 18th century dental work, rather than any wooden components. 17. Unsinkable Titanic. The RMS Titanic disaster of April 15, 1912, has become synonymous with human hubris and the dangers of overconfidence in technology. According to widespread belief, the Titanic was heavily promoted as an unsinkable ship before its maiden voyage, making its tragic sinking even more ironic and devastating. This narrative suggests that the ship's builders and operators arrogantly claimed that nothing could sink their magnificent vessel, only to be proven catastrophically wrong. However, historical evidence shows that the Titanic was never officially marketed or described as unsinkable before its maiden voyage. Contemporary advertisements and promotional materials for the Titanic emphasized its luxury, size, and advanced safety features, but did not claim absolute unsinkability. The White Star Line, which owned the ship, promoted the vessel's watertight compartments and advanced design as making it practically unsinkable under most circumstances, which was actually a reasonable claim given the ship's engineering features. The unsinkable label appears to have been applied primarily by media outlets, particularly after the disaster occurred. Newspapers found the irony of an unsinkable ship sinking to be a compelling story angle that helped sell papers and capture public attention. The dramatic contrast between supposed invincibility and actual vulnerability created a narrative that resonated with readers struggling to understand how such a tragedy could occur. Some maritime publications did describe the Titanic and similar ships as virtually unsinkable based on their compartmentalized design, but these were technical assessments rather than marketing claims. The ship's builders understood that no vessel could be completely immune to all possible disasters. The myth of pre-disaster unsinkability claims has persisted because it provides a satisfying moral lesson about pride preceding a fall and the dangers of overconfidence in human technology and engineering capabilities. 18. Egyptian Cleopatra. Cleopatra VII, the last pharaoh of ancient Egypt, is often portrayed as the quintessential Egyptian queen, embodying the exotic mystique and ancient wisdom of the land of the pyramids. Popular culture depicts her as having typical ancient Egyptian features and ethnicity, connecting her directly to the civilization that built the pyramids and created hieroglyphic writing. However, Cleopatra was actually of Macedonian Greek descent and had very little, if any, Egyptian ancestry, despite ruling Egypt for nearly 2 decades. Cleopatra belonged to the Ptolemaic dynasty, which had ruled Egypt since the conquest of Alexander the Great in 332 BCE. The Ptolemies were one of the Greek families that took control of different parts of Alexander's empire after his death. For nearly 3 centuries, the Ptolemaic rulers maintained their Greek identity and customs while governing Egypt from their capital city of Alexandria. The Ptolemaic family practiced intermarriage to keep power within their bloodline, meaning that Cleopatra's ancestry was almost entirely Macedonian Greek. Her great-great-great-great-great-great-great-grandmother was Ptolemy I, one of Alexander's generals who founded the dynasty. Through generations of intermarriage between cousins and siblings, the family maintained its Greek heritage. Cleopatra was actually the first Ptolemaic ruler to learn the Egyptian language, showing how disconnected the dynasty had become from native Egyptian culture. Most of her predecessors ruled through Greek administrators and never bothered to communicate directly with their Egyptian subjects. Despite her Greek ancestry, Cleopatra did embrace some aspects of Egyptian culture for political purposes, particularly the religious traditions that legitimized her rule. She presented herself as the reincarnation of the Egyptian goddess Isis and participated in traditional Egyptian ceremonies. The confusion about Cleopatra's ethnicity stems from the natural assumption that Egyptian rulers would be ethnically Egyptian, combined with Hollywood portrayals that have reinforced this misconception. 19 medieval Iron Maidens. The Iron Maiden stands as one of the most terrifying symbols of medieval torture, depicted as a coffin-shaped device lined with sharp spikes designed to slowly impale victims while keeping them alive as long as possible. Museums and popular culture present these gruesome devices as evidence of medieval cruelty and the dark nature of justice during the Middle Ages. Horror movies and historical fiction frequently feature Iron Maidens as the ultimate expression of medieval barbarity. However, historical evidence strongly suggests that Iron Maidens were never actually used during the medieval period and are instead 19th century fabrications. No contemporary medieval documents describe the use of Iron Maidens as torture or execution devices. Medieval records were quite detailed about legal procedures, punishments, and torture methods, but Iron Maidens do not appear in any authentic historical sources from the period. If such dramatic and effective torture devices had existed, they would almost certainly have been mentioned in legal codes, chronicles, or other documentation. The first known Iron Maiden was constructed in the late 18th or early 19th century, likely as a curiosity or museum piece designed to capitalize on growing romantic interest in medieval history. The famous Iron Maiden of Nuremberg, often cited as proof of medieval use, was actually built around 1800 and was probably created as a tourist attraction rather than a historical artifact. The Iron Maiden myth gained popularity during the 19th century when people became fascinated with what they imagined to be the brutal nature of medieval life. Writers and museum curators found that gruesome torture devices attracted visitors and readers, leading to the creation of increasingly elaborate, fictional medieval punishments. Real medieval torture methods, while certainly harsh by modern standards, were generally more practical and less theatrical than the Iron Maiden. Medieval justice focused on extracting confessions or punishing specific crimes rather than creating elaborate suffering devices. 20 Rosa Parks was tired. The story of Rosa Parks refusing to give up her bus seat in Montgomery, Alabama on December 1, 1955, has become one of the most powerful symbols of the American civil rights movement. The popular version of events suggests that Parks, a tired seamstress returning home from work, spontaneously decided she was too exhausted to move to the back of the bus when ordered by the driver. This narrative presents her act as an individual moment of personal fatigue rather than organized political resistance. However, this simplified version obscures the reality that Parks was an experienced civil rights activist who made a calculated decision as part of a broader movement strategy. Rosa Parks had been involved in civil rights activism for more than a decade before her famous bus protest. She served as secretary of the Montgomery chapter of the NEBACP and had attended training sessions on nonviolent resistance techniques. Parks was well aware of the potential consequences of her actions and had previously encountered the same bus driver who had ejected her from his bus 12 years earlier. The Montgomery bus boycott that followed Parks's arrest was not a spontaneous response, but rather a carefully planned campaign that civil rights leaders had been preparing for months. They had been waiting for the right case and the right person to challenge bus segregation laws effectively. Parks was chosen partly because her character and background would make her a sympathetic figure who could withstand the intense scrutiny that would follow. Parks herself later explained that while she was physically tired from work, she was more tired of giving in to segregation and discrimination. Her decision represented years of built-up frustration with systemic racism rather than simple physical exhaustion. The tired seamstress narrative, while emotionally compelling, diminishes Parks's role as a strategic activist and organizer who deliberately chose to challenge an unjust system. 21. Alexandria Library Fire. The destruction of the Library of Alexandria has become one of history's greatest symbols of lost knowledge and cultural devastation. Popular imagination depicts this ancient center of learning being consumed in a single catastrophic fire that destroyed countless irreplaceable texts and set back human civilization by centuries. Various historical villains have been blamed for this supposed act of vandalism, including Julius Caesar, Christian mobs, and Arab conquerors. However, the reality is that the Library of Alexandria declined gradually over several centuries, rather than being destroyed in any single dramatic event. The Library of Alexandria was actually a complex of institutions, including the main library, a smaller daughter library, and the associated museum, which functioned as a research center. These institutions faced various challenges over their long history, including funding problems, political instability, and changing educational priorities that affected their operations and collections. Several incidents did damage parts of the library complex over the centuries. Julius Caesar's siege of Alexandria in 48 BCE caused fires that damaged some buildings and manuscripts, but this was not a deliberate attack on the library itself. Christian riots in the late 4th century CE targeted pagan institutions and may have affected some library facilities. The Arab conquest of Alexandria in 641 CE, the end of the library's operation, but accounts of deliberate destruction are largely legendary. The gradual decline theory is supported by evidence that the library's influence and resources had been diminishing for centuries before any of these dramatic events. Reduced government funding, competition from other centers of learning, and the general decline of Alexandria as a political center all contributed to the library's slow deterioration. The single catastrophic fire story became popular because it provides a clear explanation for the loss of ancient knowledge and creates identifiable villains to blame, which is more emotionally satisfying than the complex reality of institutional decline. 22. Medieval hand eating. Popular depictions of medieval dining typically show people tearing at food with their bare hands like wild animals with no utensils or table manners to be seen. Movies and television shows often portray medieval feasts as chaotic affairs where nobles and peasants alike grab food directly from serving dishes and gnaw on meat bones without any consideration for hygiene or etiquette. This image reinforces stereotypes about medieval people being uncivilized and lacking in social refinement. However, historical evidence reveals that medieval Europeans used eating utensils and followed complex dining etiquette rules that were quite sophisticated for their time. Medieval people commonly used knives and spoons for eating, and these utensils were considered essential dining tools. Most adults carried personal eating knives, which served multiple purposes throughout the day, but were specifically designed for cutting food during meals. Spoons made from wood, bone, or metal were used for consuming liquid foods like stews, porridge, and soups. Forks were less common in medieval Europe but were not entirely unknown. They were used primarily for serving rather than individual eating, and their adoption for personal dining occurred gradually during the later medieval period. However, the absence of forks did not mean that people ate everything with their hands. Medieval dining etiquette was actually quite elaborate, particularly among the wealthy classes. Detailed manuals provided instructions on proper behavior at meals, including how to wash hands before eating, how to share food politely, and how to avoid offensive behaviors. These etiquette guides demonstrate that medieval people were very concerned with proper dining conduct. Even when people did eat with their hands, which was sometimes practical for certain foods, they followed specific rules about cleanliness and proper technique. Medieval diners understood the importance of washing hands thoroughly before meals and used bread trenchers as edible plates that helped maintain cleanliness. Betsy Ross flag design. The story of Betsy Ross creating the first American flag has become one of the most cherished tales in American patriotic folklore. According to this beloved narrative, George Washington personally visited Ross' Philadelphia upholstery shop in 1776 and commissioned her to sew the first Stars and Stripes flag for the new nation. The story includes the detail that Ross suggested changing Washington's original design from 6-pointed stars to 5-pointed stars because they were easier to cut and sew. However, historians have found no contemporary evidence to support this story, and it appears to be a family legend that was not publicly told until nearly a century after the supposed events occurred. The Betsy Ross story was first publicly presented in 1870 by Ross's grandson William Canby at a meeting of the Historical Society of Pennsylvania. Canby claimed that his grandmother had told him the story when he was a child, but he provided no documentation or corroborating evidence to support his account. No records from the Continental Congress, Washington's papers, or contemporary newspapers mention Ross in connection with flag creation. Historical records show that the Continental Congress did approve the design of the American flag on June 14, 1777, but they do not identify who created the first flag or flags. Multiple flag makers were working in Philadelphia at the time, and it is quite possible that Ross made American flags at some point, given her profession as an upholsterer and seamstress. The story gained popularity during America's centennial celebrations in 1876, when the nation was looking for inspiring founding myths and heroic figures to celebrate. The image of a patriotic woman contributing to the revolutionary cause appealed to audiences and fit well with developing ideas about women's roles in American history. While Ross may have made flags during the Revolutionary period, the specific story of Washington's visit and her design suggestions appears to be family folklore rather than documented historical fact. 24. Shakespeare wrote alone. William Shakespeare is universally celebrated as the greatest writer in the English language, credited with creating timeless masterpieces like Hamlet, Romeo and Juliet, and Macbeth through his individual genius and creative vision. The traditional image presents Shakespeare as a solitary artist working alone in his study, crafting every word and plot twist through personal inspiration and talent. However, theatrical collaboration was extremely common during the Elizabethan era, and modern scholarship suggests that Shakespeare likely collaborated with other writers on several of his plays, rather than creating every work in isolation. Elizabethan theatre was a highly collaborative enterprise where multiple writers often worked together to produce plays quickly for hungry audiences. Theatre companies needed new material constantly, and collaboration allowed them to produce works more rapidly while combining different writers' strengths and specialties. Playwrights would often specialize in particular types of scenes or characters, working together to create complete plays. Modern textual analysis has identified several plays traditionally attributed solely to Shakespeare that show evidence of collaboration. Timon of Athens appears to include substantial contributions from Thomas Middleton, while Pericles shows evidence of collaboration with George Wilkins. The Two Noble Kinsmen was actually published with both Shakespeare S. and John Fletcher's names as co-authors. Even plays considered entirely Shakespeare's work may have involved some collaborative elements, such as revisions by other writers or contributions to specific scenes. The boundaries between individual authorship and collaboration were much more fluid in Shakespeare's time than they are today. Additionally, Shakespeare adapted many of his plots from existing sources rather than creating entirely original stories. He drew extensively from historical chronicles, earlier plays, and popular tales, transforming existing material through his poetic language and dramatic structure. The myth of Shakespeare as a completely independent creator persists because it fits romantic notions about individual artistic genius and makes his achievements seem even more remarkable. 25. Ancient age. 30. Death. A widespread misconception about ancient and medieval life suggests that people rarely lived beyond 30 years of age, creating the impression that anyone who survived to middle age was considered elderly by historical standards. This belief implies that life expectancy was uniformly low throughout pre-modern history, and that most people died young from disease, violence, or harsh living conditions. However, this interpretation misunderstands how life expectancy statistics work and ignores the reality that many ancient people lived long, productive lives well into their 70s and 80s. The confusion arises from misinterpreting average life expectancy at birth, which was indeed low in ancient times due to extremely high infant and child mortality rates. When large numbers of children die before reaching adulthood, the statistical average becomes heavily skewed toward younger ages, even though adults who survived childhood often lived much longer lives. Ancient sources provide numerous examples of people living to advanced ages. Roman senators, Greek philosophers, and medieval monarchs frequently lived into their 60s, 70s, and beyond. Historical records show that reaching old age was certainly possible, and not uncommon among those who survived the dangerous early years of life. The high infant mortality rate in ancient times meant that perhaps 30 to 50% of children died before age 5 from diseases that are easily treatable today. However, once a person reached adulthood, their chances of living to an advanced age improved dramatically. Adults who survived childhood diseases, warfare, and childbirth could expect to live lives roughly comparable in length to modern lifespans. Ancient societies recognized and planned for aging populations. They had concepts of retirement, elder care, and generational wealth transfer that would have been unnecessary if everyone died at 30. Philosophical and religious traditions also addressed questions about aging and death that suggest longer lifespans were normal expectations. The misconception persists because it makes modern medical advances seem more dramatic and reinforces ideas about historical progress. 26. Galileo's famous quote. Galileo Galilei's trial by the Roman Inquisition in 1633 has become one of history's most famous conflicts between science and religious authority. According to popular legend, after being forced to recant his support for the heliocentric model of the solar system, Galileo defiantly muttered under his breath, "And yet it moves," referring to the Earth's motion around the Sun. This dramatic phrase, "eppur si muove," in Italian, has become symbolic of scientific truth persisting despite official suppression, and represents the idea that facts cannot be changed by authority or intimidation. However, there is no historical evidence that Galileo ever spoke these famous words during or after his trial. The earliest known attribution of this phrase to Galileo appears in a book published in 1761, more than 100 years after the trial occurred. No contemporary accounts of the proceedings, including detailed Inquisition records and witness testimonies, mention Galileo making any such statement. Given the serious nature of the charges against him and the potential consequences of continued defiance, It would have been extremely risky for Galileo to make such a provocative comment. During his trial, Galileo was actually quite careful to appear cooperative and remorseful. He formally recanted his views about heliocentrism and pledged to avoid teaching or discussing these ideas in the future. Making a defiant statement immediately after his recantation would have contradicted his strategy of avoiding harsher punishment. The quote became popular during the Enlightenment period, when philosophers and writers were developing narratives about reason triumphing over superstition. The phrase perfectly encapsulated the conflict between scientific progress and institutional resistance to new ideas, making it an appealing addition to Galileo's story. While Galileo certainly continued to believe in heliocentrism despite his public recantation, the famous quote appears to be a later addition to his legend, rather than a historically accurate statement from the trial. 27. Manhattan Bead Trade. The story of Dutch colonists purchasing Manhattan Island from Native Americans for $24 worth of beads and trinkets has become one of the most repeated tales in American history textbooks and popular culture. This narrative typically presents the transaction as evidence of either European cleverness in obtaining valuable land cheaply or Native American naivety about real estate values. However, this popular version of events oversimplifies a complex cultural exchange and misrepresents both the nature of the transaction and the items involved. The actual purchase of Manhattan occurred in 1626, when Dutch colonial official Peter Minuit negotiated with local Lenape leaders for rights to use the island. The transaction involved goods worth 60 guilders, which translates to approximately $24 in 17th century currency, but the items exchanged were not worthless beads and trinkets as commonly portrayed. The trade goods included practical items that were valuable to Native American communities, such as metal tools, weapons, cloth, and other manufactured products that were difficult or impossible to produce locally. These items represented genuine value and utility rather than decorative baubles designed to deceive unsophisticated buyers. More importantly, the concept of land ownership differed dramatically between European and Native American cultures. The Lenape likely understood the agreement as granting Europeans permission to use and share the land rather than exclusive ownership that would prevent Native American access. From their perspective, the transaction involved sharing territorial rights rather than selling property permanently. The worthless beads narrative reflects European assumptions about value and ignores the practical utility that trade goods provided to Native American communities. It also ignores the complex cultural misunderstandings that characterized early colonial negotiations and land transactions. 28. Plymouth Rock. Landing. Plymouth Rock stands as one of America's most iconic historical landmarks, marking the supposed spot where the Mayflower Pilgrims first set foot on New England soil in 1620. Millions of visitors travel to Plymouth, Massachusetts, each year to see the famous boulder that symbolizes the beginning of European settlement in the region. The rock has been enshrined in a classical monument and celebrated in countless historical accounts as the foundation stone of American civilization. However, there is no contemporary evidence that the Pilgrims actually landed at Plymouth Rock, and this story appears to be a much later invention that became accepted as historical fact. No accounts written by the Pilgrims themselves mention landing at any specific rock. William Bradford's detailed chronicle of the Plymouth colony, which serves as the primary source for early settlement history, describes the colonists exploring the coastline and choosing a location for their settlement, but makes no reference to any particular landing spot or distinctive geological feature. The Plymouth Rock story first appeared more than 100 years after the Mayflower's arrival. In 1741, 94-year-old Thomas Faunce claimed that his father had told him that the Pilgrims landed at a specific large rock on the Plymouth shore. Faunce's account was accepted by local residents and gradually became incorporated into the town's historical narrative. The rock itself has been moved several times since Faunce identified it, and pieces have broken off during these relocations. The boulder currently displayed is smaller than the original rock that Faunce pointed out, and its exact relationship to the supposed original landing site is unclear. Historical evidence suggests that the Pilgrims actually spent several weeks exploring Cape Cod before selecting Plymouth as their settlement location. They likely made multiple landings at different points along the coast, rather than arriving at a single dramatic moment at one specific rock. The Plymouth Rock story became popular because it provided a concrete, physical symbol for the abstract concept of American origins. 29. Medieval tomato fear. A persistent myth claims that medieval Europeans believed tomatoes were poisonous and refused to eat them out of superstition and ignorance. This story often extends to other New World foods, suggesting that medieval people were suspicious of unfamiliar plants and preferred to stick with traditional European crops rather than experimenting with exotic imports. The narrative reinforces stereotypes about medieval conservatism and fear of innovation, while positioning modern society as more adventurous and scientifically informed. However, this story contains a fundamental chronological error that makes it impossible. Tomatoes did not exist in medieval Europe because they had not yet been introduced from the Americas. Tomatoes are native to Central and South America and were completely unknown to Europeans until after Columbus' voyages in the late 15th century. The medieval period traditionally ends around 1450 to 1500, meaning that medieval Europeans could not have had any opinion about tomatoes because they had never encountered them. Tomatoes were first brought to Europe by Spanish conquistadors in the early 16th century, well after the medieval period had ended. Even then, their adoption as food was gradual and varied by region and social class. Some Europeans were indeed initially cautious about eating tomatoes, but this occurred during the Renaissance and early modern period, not during medieval times. The confusion may arise from the fact that wealthy Europeans in the 16th and 17th centuries sometimes did avoid tomatoes, but for a different reason than superstition. Tomatoes are acidic and could cause lead poisoning when eaten from pewter plates that were common among the upper classes. This created a legitimate health concern rather than irrational fear. Additionally, tomatoes belong to the nightshade family, which includes some poisonous plants. So caution about new members of this plant family was actually scientifically reasonable rather than superstitious. The medieval tomato fear myth persists because it fits common misconceptions about medieval people being uniformly suspicious of change and innovation. 30. Doubleday invented baseball. For more than a century, American schoolchildren have learned that Abner Doubleday invented baseball in Cooperstown, New York, in 1839, creating America's national pastime in a moment of inspiration and athletic innovation. This story places the birth of baseball at a specific time and location, giving the sport a clear American origin and founding father figure comparable to other national institutions. The Baseball Hall of Fame was established in Cooperstown partly based on this origin story, and the town has built a thriving tourism industry around its supposed role as baseball's birthplace. However, historical evidence clearly shows that Doubleday had nothing to do with inventing baseball and that the sport evolved gradually from various earlier games rather than being created by any single person. The Doubleday story was created by Albert Spaulding's commission in 1907, which was tasked with establishing baseball's American origins in response to claims that the sport derived from British games like rounders. The commission relied heavily on a letter from Abner Graves, who claimed to have witnessed Doubleday laying out the first baseball diamond in Cooperstown. However, Graves was demonstrably unreliable, and his account contained numerous factual errors and inconsistencies. Doubleday himself never claimed to have invented baseball and showed no particular interest in the sport throughout his life. He was primarily known as a career military officer who served in the Civil War and achieved the rank of Major General. His personal writings and correspondence contain no references to baseball or any involvement in developing sporting activities. Historical evidence shows that baseball evolved from various bat and ball games that were played throughout America and Britain in the early 19th century. Games similar to modern baseball were being played in New York and other cities years before Doubleday's supposed invention, and the rules developed gradually through practical experience rather than being designed by any single innovator. The Doubleday myth persists because it provides a satisfying origin story for America's national pastime and supports the idea that baseball is uniquely American rather than derived from foreign games.